Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on the state of the Malazan Empire. And today we're going to talk about Toll the Hounds, Book 2, chapters 9 and 10. So, this is the second part of Book 2, and tomorrow I'll wrap it up with the third part, which will be chapters 11 and 12. So on Monday, we're going to start with book 3 of Toll the Hounds. So let's see where that's going. I suspect we'll need more than we might actually need 4 days for the end of Toll the Hounds. Book 4 is super long. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, let's get this started. Cheers. All right. So there's a bunch of things I want to talk about today. And why not start with capitalism and its evils? Because that's something that I personally have views on. That's not what we're going to go do today. Now, I recently said that it feels like Letheras is sort of the dark side of the Rujistan, with it as a city, with its focus on capitalism, on how to get all the on monetary wealth and stuff like that. And I stand by it, but I feel compared, and this is going to go into a broader issue. But when we look at it today, mostly at these chapters in Toll the Hounds about the Rujistan, the focus on money and monetary wealth is once again a thing here, right? We have that visit now of Gorlas Vidicus to the mines where Harlow has been sold as a slave. And what we see there is once again indentured slavery and real slavery, and all in the name of exploiting the workforce to get money for a few rich and powerful people. So we see something that would be very much at home in Letheras, being a thing that happens in Darujistan. Now, the question there obviously is it something that is new to Darujistan? Because when you look at how the city was portrayed in Garden of the Moon, that was not a concern. It was hardly ever mentioned. I mean, yeah, there was obviously clear that there's highborn people, noblemen, noble families who are probably also rich, stuff like that. But the general idea of economic inequality and different classes and class exploitation was not actually mentioned at all in Gardens of the Moon. But it crops up now, and there's a bunch of questions that you can look at why this is the case now. One of them may be that it is a new trend with these younger councilmen that are building their power more on economic wealth and less on what you might call symbolic capital, or just their family names and accumulated power and clout that comes with just being of a powerful rich family. Not so much rich family, but powerful family. So the traditional conservative way of looking at it, there was more of a thing. Reputation and such and lineage were maybe more important at that point. And we see now, when we come back to Darujistan, that the actual monetary wealth someone has may become more of an issue now. So there could be a change within the society, within Darujistan, with the rise of the merchant and craftsman, but mostly merchant class in a way. And that would be something that you could look at and see when you look at, I don't know, Humble Measure, which is, an amazing name for the kind of guy he is. But you could look at that and see that. It's maybe that's basically what you could also see when you look at, I don't know, Western history, and look at the rise of the merchant class within European society in the 17th, 18th century, when nobility or old nobility slowly faded in faded in importance. That's something that you can see, like, I guess, in this, depending on which country you look at, you see that something happening somewhat anywhere between, let's say, 16th and 18th century, maybe even 19th century, where actual when with the rise of the our still common, like, monetary economic system with banking and all of that, and you see that point where actually owning the money or being able to make money and get money becomes more important than all this symbolic capital that you amassed or got by virtue of birth. And that's, once again, I guess Bourdieu is the author to read here if you want to look at this kind of thing. And that's something, that one way to look at why suddenly the economy is more important in how we look at how Darujhistan is portrayed in Toll the Hounds. The other option, obviously, is that now our characters, like everyone that shows up in Darujhistan, that we are looking at the city through their eyes. I mean, obviously, we're mostly looking at the city through Krupp's eyes, and maybe that Krupp has always been aware of that. I would need to go back to Gardens of the Moon and look at what we hear Krupp saying there, but I can't remember anything poignant on economic inequality being put out there by him at the time. But it may just, that's my point, that like the people that we're looking at now are older, maybe more jaded, maybe more realistic, more, you know what I mean. They've been around a while, especially someone like Cutter has seen the world. He obviously hasn't liked it that much, but he has like a new, like less naive, less romantic view of the world than he had at the beginning in Gardens of the Moon. So it may also be that our, like, heroes, or not heroes, but our viewpoint characters that we have in Toll the Hounds are more aware of the importance of the factor that economic inequality plays, or that economics and money play in our society. That's like the other way to look at it. It's like they are just more aware of it than they were in Gardens of the Moon, because they've seen more of that. So yeah, that may be the other way to look at it. I just found it interesting to see it's either Darujhistan losing its innocence, so to speak, or it's that our characters, having lost their innocence, they are now able to see, or can't avoid seeing, all these glaring inequalities. And when I say innocence here, I mean innocence in the biblical sense of having, for the characters, like having to actually, eaten that forbidden fruit that is realism, I guess. So I'm not quite sure how to read it, but I just found it interesting that this time around, the Darujhistan feels darker. It feels darker than it felt in Gardens of the Moon, where it was all, well, not all fun and games, but once again, it's like you had a conspiracy there with Turban Orr and whatever the old limb's name was, and they have this conspiracy about getting the Malazans in, getting power through the Malazan occupiers. Now you have their sons playing at the same thing, but suddenly their power is not an occupying force, but their way to power and domination is monetary wealth and greed connected to that. And it just feels that in Toll the Hound, everyone is more jaded, more jaded, more greedy. Like, it just feels darker, or a bit more seedy, a bit more grimy than everything felt in Gardens of the Moon. It just really hit me during these two chapters, mostly chapter 9. It just really hit me that how much darker Darujhistan is now than it was when we first found it in Gardens of the Moon in book 2, when we have Crocus doing his thievery and all of that stuff. The atmosphere is a less optimistic one in a way. And that obviously makes a lot of sense, you know. And it's once again one of those situations where I'm like, that's just like how good a writer Stephen Erickson is in that regard, that he manages to actually portray this city in these two different ways over time and show all these things. So that, yeah, that's just the thing in there that makes that I wanted to point out. The other thing, obviously, is once again we go back to power structures, and that's the sad thing of power structures. Now, this is something that Stephen Erickson, you know, touches on from time to time, but it's definitely something that we see here with the whole dynamic between Harlow and Baynisk and whatever that other guy's name is, and I'm sure it will come up in the future chapters. But we already see it also in that conversation with that foreman of the mines and Gorlas Viticus, where you have that whole conversation, and the whole idea is that people that are inside said power structure and are unable to think outside that power structure. Well, Harlow might, but everyone else is just trying for a higher position within that power structure. It's like you accept the structure, and all you do is you kick down and you scrape upwards to get as high as possible, which you can see with that guy, with that foreman in that conversation with Gorlas Viticus. The problem with that is you will never get out of that miserable structure if you just aim to reach the top of the structure, because the people actually free are the people like Gorlas Viticus, who are outside of that structure in a way. Now, he might be mentally in the same structure because he wants to gain wealth and so forth, but the point is, we need to break down such structures and think outside of those structures, outside the box, so to speak, or otherwise we'll never actually get rid of toxic structures and hierarchies. That's the sad truth of it, and it's shown pretty well there. Although, once again, there will be more to say about that in the future, and how that is shown, and how maybe Stephen Erickson is showing us the same thing. It's like we need to get outside of the power structure. It's never just being the meanest bastard in the pit. The goal is to get out of the pit and leave the pit behind, so to speak. All right, so there's that to be talked about. What else? I guess we need to talk more about relationships. Once again, that's like relationships, sort of romantic. I don't want to call them romantic at this point, but the relationships are a main part of at least the Daruzhistan plot lines, or the Daruzhistan part of Toll the Hounds. Both very toxic relations and not so toxic ones, and people failing at it, and people trying to succeed at it. And we have a lot of that. We have obviously the more or less happy marriage of Torvald, Nom, and Tessera. On the one hand, we have the highly toxic one of Gorlas Viticus and Chalice Dal, and that's one that also makes sense to talk about more, because what we see there is a lot of things. We see the cynical, calculating person Gorlas Viticus, who is nevertheless caught up in the in that structure, in that game of all these like societal rules and expectations. Because yes, he has married a rich noblewoman. Well, he doesn't want her because, from what we can see, he's apparently gay, which, you know, is fine. but he can't openly do that, be that in that structure, because as a noble person, if he wants to play that game of power, success, and so forth, which seems to be the only game he knows, and that's the only way he can, you know, the only way he can think of a successful or satisfying life. He needs to do these things. He needs to marry a woman to, fulfill expectations and so forth. And the only way he can like justify that to himself is then to think of her as a part of that game of power and wealth, and using her as such, because that's the only way he can do it. And it's kind of sad. I mean, it's really sad. That's the point. That if you are in that situation, the only options are basically giving up the game and doing something entirely different, or playing the game whether you want to play it the way you want, whether you want or not, because those parts are part of the game. And we see how that then damages someone like Chalice, who obviously suffers from being just used, because no one wants to be used. We all want to be the people who use, or at least, act. It's once again that question of agency that I've spoken about before. It's like we all want agency, or at least the illusion of agency. And she doesn't have that. So what she starts doing then is trying to find ways for herself to prove to herself that she still has some kind of agency, right? And we have that situation with she expresses that really nicely in her thoughts about the idea of the leash or the chain, and that you can people that sometimes turn against their master and attack them and so forth, because that's the only way to get out of there, in a way. Now, obviously, we have that situation here where and that's like the seedy part. There is when we have that evening, that situation where Gorlas basically goes away, cynically hoping that his wife will be unfaithful, and either one of the other two councilmen will actually sleep with her, ideally get her pregnant, so he has an heir that he can totally take as his own, and still then use that as leverage against whoever of the two, or ideally two, or both of them, were sleeping. Yes, were cheating, or she was cheating with. That's the way to put it. But the point is that everyone in that group is aware of how that's going. It's like Orr and Lim know what's going on. Sharda and Lim and Hanat Orr know what's going on. Chalice knows what's going on, and Gorlas knows what's going on. And I feel that that bit is one of those parts where you can see Stephen Erickson's training in modern literary fiction coming through, because that's that's the kind of setup you get in a lot of modern like short stories or serious realistic fiction, where you have all these unhappy people knowing that they're unhappy, still fucking up even more, dragging themselves deeper and deeper down there. The only thing missing there is obviously a divorce, because that will be necessary for a modern American literary fiction piece. At least one of them would need to actually get divorced and at some point. But just saying that this is one of those field which is super modern to have that situation where everyone is calculating, and the whole idea of love, whatever that may be, just gets completely thrown out the window, and it's just a lot of like darker emotions and ambitions that are traded there. And even now we basically know where this will be going, because yeah, I don't know, don't do that shit. Never. It's just something that I've sometimes also learned in my own life. It's like, don't do that. It's not good. It's gonna hurt. It's gonna come back and tarnish whatever you may call your soul, conscience, or whatever. It's gonna leave scars, and we'll see where those will be coming from or showing up in the coming chapters. All right, what else to look at? Um, the however it will be relationship or whatever with the relationship between or the relation between Silara and Crocus Cutter, and him being unable to distance himself from or like find closure with his love for Absalar. This is like another thing that is that is really important, because what happens is, once again, I rather, like, I would say, realistic modern look at how we deal with such things. Like, I don't know, it's like if a relationship ends, we all need closure, and we also need distance to actually, you know, move on. That takes time. That takes a lot of time. And Crocus Cutter never got that time, or never took that time. So Solara never had a chance to actually, you know, be anything but just a replacement. That's just how human nature works. You can't just like throw yourself into something else and expect it to actually be something else. Like, closure can take ages. Like, seriously, ages. Um, I'm just saying that because, yeah, once again, I've had personal experience with that kind of thing. It can take forever, and we see that with, and Silara is slowly coming to realize it. On the other hand, with Cutter, you obviously have that other part where he's like digging himself into this "I'm unworthy" hole, which is another really dangerous bit to end up when it's like, I'm dangerous to everyone else, and I need to be alone. And man, yeah, it's bad. There's a scene in there's a scene in Guards by Terry Pratchett which really expresses the stupidity of that way of going somewhere. But once again, it's a very human way to go, and we'll see where Cutter will end up with all of this, because, you know, it's not healthy, is what it is. Another thing that I felt interesting, and I feel for now, most of the interesting shit is happening in Darujistan. There is obviously a lot of very important stuff going on at the Barrow and in Black Coral, but at least in these two chapters, most of it was actually action driven or whatever. So I don't know yet how to actually talk about that or extract a lot of smart things from it. Not that I extract a lot of smart things from other parts, but I don't know. It's even more difficult to pretend at smartness with those bits. No, but I wanted to talk about the idea of like the events where Berethel tries to join the blacksmith guild. And that is a very fine lesson in the absurdity of discrimination, of whether it's racial or any other kind of discrimination, where you raise formal barriers to keep people out without, you know, being openly racist or anything like that. I'm using the word racist here because it's Barathol is from a different place, and that's sort of the main issue there. It's like, he can't join the guild, and there's a lot of formal things that are put up because that's how you do it when you don't want to appear to be just open. It's like, no, you can't do that anymore. So you build up a whole like closed system with a lot of rules that make it impossible for an outsider to enter that society, that community, or whatever. And when you look at history, it's something that has happened in real world history for a long time, even like in times where it was already sort of where it happened, sometimes happened at least, that people of color gained monetary wealth. They were still kept out of society, of those closed higher societies. That was just how it works, and you can come up with all kinds of arbitrary bullshit rules to do that, to just keep your community closed off, which, you know, is basically gatekeeping. And we do that in all our small nerd communities as well. Some communities more than others, some people more than others. But it is something that happens there as well. But it also, I feel it's like important to be aware of the fact that this happens outside of our fun and games online nerd communities or whatever, which have, like, gatekeeping there has a real brutal impact on the mental health of people kept out. But it still goes on and happens in the world of jobs, and so forth. So to be aware of that is obviously important. And the way that Steven Erikson tackles it here in Toll the Hounds is by showing how fucking ridiculous it in the end is, how cruel and ridiculous, because it's ridiculous, like the way it's portrayed. It is ridiculous, but it's also cruel. It's the sheer cruelty of people who are afraid of losing a privilege, and that's what it boils down to. And you see that in there, and I just felt it might be interesting to point that out. All right. What else to look at? I mean, I feel we'll have us a talk about our Tist Andy group of Nimander and so forth tomorrow, because at this point, I feel it's easier to talk about all the stuff that's going on there with the dying god and all of that once we get through Bastion. I think that's gonna be tomorrow. I'm not 100% sure, but I feel it's gonna be tomorrow. So I'm kind of leaving that one out for now. What else would be interesting to look at? And the Silan meeting Caladan Brood is obviously another one where there's not that much like being talked about yet. Once again, I feel like a lot of this stuff in... Okay, this is interesting in itself, the way that Steven Erikson manages to make the whole storyline around the Barrow, around all of that part, how he manages to give that this feeling, at least for me, this feeling of pressure and foreboding. Not foreshadowing. Well, there's a lot of foreshadowing going on as well, but it's, you read that, and even if you don't know what's going to happen, you can feel the pressure, how it just, everything just pressures down and builds up and waits for some kind of release in the future. And it's that level of yeah, that level of pressure, built up pressure, penned up pressure in Black Coral that I find interesting, but it also makes those chapters pretty hard to read for me. It's like, yeah, I don't know. Difficult to explain. Although I think we might have a quick look at the whole thing with Seerdomin coming on the coming upon the conspiracy around the Barrow and the city that is sort of planning to overthrow the Tist Andy, which, will it work? Will it not work? We don't know. But his reflections on why people want to go back to a status, the idea that within tyranny or any power structure, the love for power and the coin that it is measured in, which is fear of people that you have power over. Now, that is something that a lot of people come to love, and that is the thing that will encourage tyranny in the end. There's that one quote that I already kind of half forgot again, which was that tyrants rise as soon as the first fool says yes, or something like that. And that's very true. And it's important that, you see, those things are self-perpetuating. It's one of those things that why hierarchies in the military or any other hierarchical structures, like the people at the bottom are like treated like shit. So that as soon as they manage to climb up one rank, they start treating the people under them like shit, because now they have the power to give that all back. And that's why these power structures within hierarchical systems of any kind, especially obviously, and I mean it's the most brutal way in like more violent or structures that have stuff like violence. Would it be, I don't know, your student, fraternities or what have you, or the military or the police or whatever. You have all these with like initiation rituals and shit like that. You do all of that just to build and reinforce and that power structure, and it's all built on that rush of adrenaline when someone fears you. It's like, will that happen again and again and again? I don't know. But there is a certain, how to say, it's something that is very deeply ingrained in human nature still, and it's sad that it is there. Which, kind of comes back to that discussion, or part of the discussion that Daika has with Solara about history repeating itself and humanity finding itself in the same situation again and again and again, which is something that, I mean, Daika is not the first one who does that. It's like, I feel like back in the day I compared, like, when I was talking about different approaches to history and historiography, where I said, like, you have Heboric on the one hand, you have Daika on the other hand, and Daika is definitely closer to, at least at the beginning, and still closer to your Thucydides, who also said at the beginning of his Peloponnesian War, he starts out like, yeah, I write this all down, so once you, humanity, will find yourself in the same dumb situation, which I know you will, you can read how it turned out the first time. And not that I expect that you will learn from it, but that's sort of how he starts that thing out. And Daika is at that point as well, which kind of makes sense when you look back at how the quotes that we have from Daika outside of Dead House Gates, which obviously is the way out there. His historiography, his writing was always trying to be as objective as possible, which is sort of the way that Thucydides also writes history. Well, he claims to be objective. He obviously isn't, but that's a different point. But yeah, the point, the idea there is that once you actually humanize it, dramatize it, and make it into whatever Fisher Kelteth is doing, that's the way to get out there and extract that human truth that is found in history, whether it is repeating or not. Once you've extracted that into a human and boiled it down to that to those questions and answers and facets of the human condition, that's what you can actually do with history there, and not just like figure out that the same events will come back again, 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 and again. But yeah, I feel that's sort of all I wanted to say for today. I'll see you tomorrow for more of the same, which is Toll the Hounds, and we'll have more to talk about, all kinds of stuff. Until then, have a great Thursday, and see you tomorrow. Cheers.